History of Holland by George Edmundson, Part 11. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of Holland, Part 11. The East and West India Company's Commercial and Economic Expansion. An account of the foundation, constitution, and early efforts of the Dutch East India Company has been already given. The date of its charter, March the 20th, 1602, was later than that of its English rival, December the 31st, 1600. But in reality the Dutch were the first in the field, as there were several small companies in existence and competing with one another in the decade previous to the granting of the charter, which, without extinguishing these companies, incorporated them by the name of chambers under a common management, the Council of 17. The four chambers, however, Amsterdam, Zeeland, the Maas, Rotterdam and Delft, and the North Quarter, Enkhuizen and Heuren, though separately administered and with different spheres, became gradually more and more unified by the growing power of control exercised by the 17. This was partly due to the dominating position of the single Chamber of Amsterdam, which held half the shares and appointed 8 members of the council. The erection of such a company, with its monopoly of trade and its great privileges, including the right of maintaining fleets and armed forces, of concluding treaties, and of erecting forts, was nothing less than the creation of an imperium in imperio, and it may be said to have furnished the model on which all the great chartered companies of later times have been formed. The English East India Company was, by the side of its Dutch contemporary, almost insignificant. With its invested capital of 30,000, it was in no position to struggle successfully against a competitor which started with subscribed funds amounting to £540,000. The conquest of Portugal by Spain had spelt ruin to that unhappy country and to its widespread colonial empire and extensive commerce. Before 1581, Lisbon had been a great centre of the Dutch carrying trade, and many Netherlanders had taken service in Portuguese vessels, and were familiar with the routes both to the East Indies and to Brazil. It was the closing of the port of Lisbon to Dutch vessels that led the enterprising merchants of Amsterdam and Middelburg to look further afield. In the early years of the 17th century, a great number of expeditions left the Dutch harbour for the Indian Ocean, and made great profits, and very large dividends were paid to the shareholders of the company. How far these represented the actual gain it is difficult to discover, for the accounts were kept in different sets of ledgers, and it is strongly suspected that the size of the dividends may at times, when enhanced credit was necessary for the raising of loans, have been to some extent fictitious. For the enterprise, which began as a trading concern, speedily developed into the creation of an empire overseas, and this meant immense expenditure. The Malay archipelago was the chief scene of early activity, and more especially the Moluccas. Treaties were made with the native chiefs, and factories defended by forts were established at Tidor, Ternate, Amboina, Banda, and other places. The victories of Cornelis Matelief established that supremacy of the Dutch arms in these eastern waters which they were to maintain for many years. With the conclusion of the truce, the necessity of placing the general control of so many scattered forts and trading posts in the hands of one supreme official led in 1609 to the appointment of a Governor-General by the 17, with the assent of the States-General. The Governor-General held office for 5 years, and he was assisted by a council, the first member of which, under the title of Director-General, was in reality Minister of Commerce. Under him were at first 7, afterwards 8, local governors. These functionaries, though exercising considerable powers in their respective districts, were in all matters of high policy entirely subordinate to the Governor-General. The first holders of the office were all men who had risen to that position by proving themselves to possess energy and enterprise, and being compelled by the distance from home to act promptly on their own initiative, were practically endowed with autocratic authority. In consequence of this, the Dutch Empire in the East became, in their hands, rapidly extended and consolidated, to the exclusion of all competitors. This meant not only that the Portuguese and Spaniards were ousted from their formerly dominant position in the Orient, but that a collision with the English was inevitable. The first Governor-General, Peter Booth, had made Java the centre of administration, and had established factories and posts at Bantam, Jakarta, and Jepara, not without arousing considerable hostility among the local rulers, jealous of the presence of intruders. This hostility was fostered and encouraged by the English, whose vessels had also visited Java, and had erected a trading post close to that of the Dutch at Jakarta. Already the Spice Islands had been the scene of hostile encounters between the representatives of the two nations, and had led to many altercations. This was the state of things when Jan Pieterszoon Koen became Governor-General in 1615. This determined man, whose experience in the East Indies was of long date, and who had already served as Director-General, came into his new office with an intense prejudice against the English, and with a firm resolve to put an end to what he described as their treachery and intrigues. Were they masters, he wrote home, the Dutch would quickly be out of the Indies. But praise be to the Lord who has provided otherwise. They are an unendurable nation. With this object he strongly fortified the factory near Jakarta, thereby arousing the hostility of the Pangeran, as the native ruler was styled. The English in their neighbouring post also began to erect defences, and to encourage the Pangeran in his hostile attitude. Koen therefore fell upon the English and destroyed and burnt their factory, and finding that there was a strong English fleet under Sir Thomas Dale in the neighbourhood, he sailed to the Moluccas in search of reinforcements, leaving Peter van der Broek in command at the factory. The Pangeran now feigned friendship, and having enticed Broek to a conference, made him prisoner and attacked the Dutch stronghold. The garrison, however, held out until the Governor-General returned with a strong force. With this he stormed and destroyed the town of Jakarta, and on its site erected a new town as the seat of the company's government, to which the name Batavia was given. From this time the Dutch had no rivalry to fear in Java. The conquest of the whole island was only a matter of time, and the pearl of the Malay archipelago has from 1620 to the present been the richest and most valuable of all the Dutch colonial possessions. Koen was planning to follow up his success by driving the English likewise from the Moluccas, when he heard that the home government had concluded a treaty which tied his hands. The position in the Moluccas had for some time been one of continual bickering and strife, the chief scene being in the little group known as the Banda Islands. The lucrative spice trade tempted both companies to establish themselves by building forts, and the names of Amboina and Pulau Rum were for many years to embitter the relations of the two peoples. Meanwhile, the whole subject of those relations had been in 1619 discussed at London by a special embassy sent nominally to thank King James for the part he had taken in bringing the Synod of Dort to a successful termination of its labours, but in reality to settle several threatening trade disputes. Almost the only result of the prolonged conferences was an agreement June 2nd, 1619, by which the East India Companies were for 20 years to be virtually amalgamated. The English were to have half the pepper crop in Java and 1/3 of the spices in the Moluccas, Amboina and the Banda Islands. Forts and posts were to remain in their present hands, but there was to be a joint council for defence, 4 members from each company, the president to be appointed alternately month by month. Such a scheme was a paper scheme devised by those who had no personal acquaintance with the actual situation. There was no similarity between a great military and naval organisation like the Dutch company and a body of traders like the English, whose capital was small and who were entirely dependent on the political vagaries of an impecunious sovereign whose dearish wish at the time was to cultivate close relations with the very power in defiance of whose prohibition the East India Company's trade was carried on. The agreement received indeed a fresh sanction at another conference held in London, 1622–23, but it never was a working arrangement. The bitter ill feeling that had arisen between the Dutch and English traders was not to be allayed by the diplomatic subterfuge of crying peace when there was no peace. Events were speedily to prove that this was so. The trade in spices had proved the most lucrative of all, and measures had been taken to prevent any undue lowering of the price by a glut in the market. The quantity of spices grown was carefully regulated, suitable spots being selected, and the trees elsewhere destroyed. Thus cloves were specially cultivated at Amboina, nutmegs in the Banda Islands. Into this strictly guarded monopoly, from which the English had been expelled by the energy of Koen, there were now by the new treaty to be admitted to a share. It was only with difficulty that the Dutch were induced to acquiesce sullenly in the presence of the intruders. A fatal collision took place almost immediately after the convention between the companies about the trade in the Spice Islands had been renewed in London, 1622–3. In 1623 Koen was succeeded as Governor-General by Peter Carpentier, whose name is still perpetuated by the Gulf of Carpentaria on the north of Australia. At this time of transition the governor of Amboina, Van Spult, professed to have discovered a conspiracy of the English settlers, headed by Gabriel Towerson, to make themselves master of the Dutch fort. 18 Englishmen were seized, and though there was no evidence against them, except what was extorted by torture, and afterwards solemnly denied, 12, including Towerson, were executed. Carpentier admitted that the proceedings were irregular, and they were in any case unnecessary, for a dispatch recalling Towerson was on its way to Amboina. It was a barbarous and cruel act, and when the news of the massacre of Amboina, as it was called, reached England, there was loud indignation and demands for redress. But the quarrel with Spain over the marriage of the Prince of Wales had driven James I, at the very end of his life, and Charles I on his accession, to seek the support of the United Provinces. By the Treaty of Southampton, September 17, 1625, an offensive and defensive alliance was concluded with the States General, and Charles contented himself with the demand that the States should, within 18 months, bring to justice those who were responsible for the bloody butchery on our subjects. However, Carleton again pressed for the punishment of the perpetrators of the foul and bloody act of Amboina. The Dutch replied with evasive promises, which they never attempted to carry out, and Charles' disastrous war with France and his breach with his Parliament effectually prevented him from taking steps to exact reparation. But Amboina was not forgotten. The sore rankled and was one of the causes that moved Cromwell to war in 1654. The activity of the Dutch in eastern waters was, however, by no means confined to Java, their seat of government, or to the Moluccas and Banda Islands with their precious spices. Many trading posts were erected on the large islands of Sumatra and Borneo. Trading relations were opened with Siam from 1613 onwards. In 1623, a force under Willem Bontekoe was sent by Koen to Formosa. The island was conquered and a governor appointed, with his residence in Fort Zeelandia. Already under the first Governor-General, Pieter Both, permission was obtained from the shogun for the Dutch, under close restrictions, to trade with Japan, a permission which was still continued after the expulsion of the Portuguese and the bloody persecution of the Christian converts, 1632–42, though under somewhat humiliating conditions. But with the Dutch trade was trade, and under the able conduct of Francis Caron it became of thriving proportions. During the next century no other Europeans had any access to the Japanese market except the agents of the Dutch East India Company. Among the governors-general of this early period, the name of Antony van Diemen deserves special recognition. If Koen laid the firm foundations of Dutch rule in the East, Van Diemen built wisely and ably on the work of Koen. Carpentier's rule had been noteworthy for several voyages of discovery along the coasts of New Guinea and of the adjoining shore of Australia, but the spirit of exploration reached its height in the days of Van Diemen. The north and northwest of Australia being to some extent already known, Abel Tasman was dispatched by Van Diemen to find out, if possible, how far southward the land extended. Sailing in October 1642 from Mauritius, he skirted portions of the coast of what is now Victoria and New South Wales, and discovered the island which he named after his patron, Van Diemen's Land, but which is now very appropriately known as Tasmania. Pressing on, he reached New Zealand, which still bears the name that he gave to it, and sailed through the strait between the northern and southern islands, now Cook's Strait. In the course of this great voyage he next discovered the Friendly or Tonga Islands and the Fiji archipelago. He reached Batavia in June 1643, and in the following year he visited again the north of Australia and voyaged right round the Gulf of Carpentaria. Even in a modern map of Australia, Dutch names will be found scattered round certain portions of the coast of the island continent, recording still historically the names of the early Dutch explorers, their patrons, ships and homes. Along the shores of the Gulf of Carpentaria may be seen Van Diemen River, Gulf and Cape, Abel Tasman, Van Elfen, Nassau and Staten rivers, Capes Arnhem, Caron and Maria, after Francis Caron and Maria van Diemen, and Grote Eland. In Tasmania, with many other names, may be found Frederick Henry Bay and Cape, Tasman's Peninsula and Tasman's Head and Maria Island, while the wife of the Governor-General is again commemorated the northernmost point of New Zealand, bearing the name of Maria van Diemen Cape. To Van Diemen belongs the credit given to the Dutch their first footing, 1638, in the rich island of Ceylon, by concluding a treaty with the native Prince of Kandy. The Portuguese still possessed forts at Colombo, Gal, Negumbo and other places, but Gal and Negumbo were now taken by the Dutch, and gradually the whole island passed into their hands, and became for a century and a half their richest possessions in the east, next to Java. On the Coromandel coast, posts were early established, and trade relations opened up with the Persians and Arabs. At the time when the Treaty of Munster gave to the United Provinces the legal title to that independence for which they had so long fought, and conceded to them the freedom to trade in the Indies, that trade was already theirs, safeguarded by the fleets, the forts, and the armed forces of the Chartered Company. The Governor-General at Batavia had become a powerful potentate in the eastern seas, and a succession of bold and able men, by a policy at once prudent and aggressive, had in the course of a few decades organised a colonial empire. It was a remarkable achievement for so small a country as the United Provinces, and it was destined to have a prolonged life. The voyage round by the Cape was long and hazardous, so Van Diemen, in 1638, caused the island of Mauritius to be occupied as a refitting station, and in 1652 one of his successors, Reyniers, sent a body of colonists under Jan van Riebeck to form a settlement which should be a harbour of refuge beneath the Table Mountain at the Cape itself. This was the beginning of the Cape Colony. Quite as interesting, and even more exciting, was the history of Dutch enterprise in other seas during this eventful period. The granting of the East India Company's charter led a certain Willem Usselincx to come forward as an earnest and persistent advocate for the formation of a West India Company on the same lines, but Oldenbarneveldt, anxious to negotiate a peace or truce with Spain and to maintain good relations with that power, refused to lend any countenance to his proposals, either before or after the truce was concluded. He could not, however, restrain the spirit of enterprise that with increasing prosperity was abroad in Holland. The formation of the Northern or Greenland Company in 1613, specially created in order to contest the claims of the English Muscovy Company to exclusive rights in the whale fishery of Spitsbergen, led to those violent disputes between the fishermen of the two countries, of which an account has been given. The granting of a charter to the Company of New Netherland, 1614, was a fresh departure. The voyage of Henry Hudson in the Dutch service, when in 1610 he explored the coast of North America and sailed up the river called by his name, led certain Amsterdam and Huron merchants to plan a settlement near this river, and they secured a charter giving them exclusive rights from Chesapeake Bay to Newfoundland. The result was the founding of the colony of New Netherland, with New Amsterdam on Manhattan Island as its capital. This settlement was at first small and insignificant, but being placed midway between the English colonies on that same coast, it added one more to the many questions of dispute between the two sea powers. Willem Usselincx had at this time continued his agitation for the erection of a West India Company, and at last, with the renewal of the war with Spain in 1621, his efforts were rewarded. The charter granted by the States General, June 3, 1621, gave to the company for 24 years the monopoly of navigation and trade to the coastlands of America and the West Indies, from the south end of Newfoundland to the Straits of Magellan, and to the coasts and lands of Africa from the Tropic of Cancer to the Cape of Good Hope. The governing body consisted of 19 representatives, the 19. The States General contributed to the capital 1 million gulden, on half of which only they were to receive dividends. They also undertook in time of war to furnish 16 ships and 4 yachts, the company being bound to supply a like number. The West India Company from the first was intended to be an instrument of war. Its aims were buccaneering rather than commerce. There was no secret about its object. It was openly proclaimed. Its historian, De Let, himself a director, wrote, "There is no surer means of bringing our enemy at last to reason than to infest him with attacks everywhere in America and to stop the fountainhead of his best finances." After some tentative efforts, it was resolved to send out an expedition in great force, But the question arose where best to strike. By the advice of Usslinx and others associated with the condition of the defences of the towns upon the American coast, Bahia, the capital of the Portuguese colony of Brazil, was selected as specially vulnerable. Thus in the west as in the east, Portugal was to suffer for her unwilling subjection to the crown of Castile. The consent of the States General and of the Stadtholder being obtained, some months were spent in making preparations on an adequate scale. The fleet, which consisted of 23 ships of war with 4 yachts, armed with 500 pieces of ordnance, and carrying an addition to the crews a force of 1,700 troops, sailed in 2 contingents. December 1623 and January 1624, Jacob Willekens was the admiral-in-chief, with Piet Hein as his vice-admiral. Colonel Jan van Dorth, Lord of Horst, was to conduct the land operations and to be the governor of the town, when its conquest was achieved. On May the 9th the fleet sailed into the Bay of All Saints, Bahia de Todos os Santos, and proceeded to disembark the troops on a sandy beach a little to the east of the city of San Salvador, commonly known as Bahia. It was strongly situated on heights rising sheer from the water, and as news of the Dutch preparations had reached Lisbon and Madrid, its fortifications had been repaired and its garrison strengthened. In front of the lower town, below the cliffs, was a rocky island, and on this and on the shore were forts well provided with batteries, and under their lee were 15 ships of war. On May the 10th Piet Hein was sent with 5 vessels to contain the enemy's fleet and cover the landing of the military forces, but Hein, far from being content with a passive role, attacked the Portuguese, burnt or captured all their ships, and then, embarking his men in launches, stormed the defences of the island and spiked the guns. Meanwhile, the troops had without opposition occupied a Benedictine convent on the heights opposite the town, but the daring of Piet Hein had caused a panic to seize the garrison. Despite the efforts of the governor, Diogo do Mendoza Furdado, there was a general exodus in the night, both of the soldiery and the inhabitants. When morning came, the Dutch marched into the undefended town, the governor and his son, who had refused to desert their posts, being taken prisoners. They, with much booty, were at once sent to Holland as a proof of the completeness of the victory. Events, however, were to prove that it is easier for an expeditionary force to capture a town at such a distance from the home base of supplies than to retain it. Governor van Dorth had scarcely entered upon his duties when he fell into an ambush of native levies near San Salvador and was killed. His successor, Willem Schouten, was incompetent and dissolute, and when the fleet set sail on its homeward voyage at the end of July, the garrison soon found itself practically besieged by bodies of Portuguese troops with Indian auxiliaries, who occupied the neighbouring woods and stopped supplies. Meanwhile, the news of the capture of San Salvador reached Madrid and Lisbon, and Spaniards and Portuguese vied with one another in their eagerness to equip a great expedition to expel the invaders. It was truly a mighty armada which set sail, under the supreme command of Don Fadrique de Toledo, from the Iberian ports at the beginning of 1625, for it consisted of 50 ships with 5 caravels and 4 pinnaces, carrying 12,566 men and 1,185 guns. On Easter Eve, March 29th, the fleet entered All Saints' Bay in the form of a vast crescent measuring 6 leagues from tip to tip. The Dutch garrison of 2,300 men, being strongly fortified, resisted for a month, but shut in by sea and by land and badly led, They capitulated on April the 28th on condition that they were sent back to Holland. That the brilliant success of 1624 was thus so soon turned into disaster was in no way due to the supineness of the home authorities. The 19 were in no way surprised to hear of great preparations being made by the King of Spain to retake the town, and they on their part were determined to maintain their conquest by meeting force with force. Straining all their resources, 3 squadrons were equipped. The first 2, numbering 32 ships and 9 yachts, were destined for Brazil. The third, a small flying squadron of 7 vessels, was dispatched early to watch the Spanish ports. The general-in-chief of the Brazilian expedition was Boudewijn Hendrikszoon. Driven back by a succession of storms, it was not until April the 17th, 1625, that the fleet was able to leave the Channel and put out to sea. The voyage was a rapid one, and on May the 23rd Hendrikszoon sailed into the bay in battle order, only to see the Spanish flag waving over San Salvador and the mighty fleet of Admiral Toledo drawn up under the protection of its batteries. Hendrikszoon sailed slowly past the Spaniards, who did not stir, and perceiving that it would be madness to attack a superior force in such a position, he reluctantly gave orders to withdraw. On the homeward journey by the West Indies a number of rich prizes were made, but sickness made great ravages among the crews, and counted Hendrikszoon himself among its victims. The events of the following year seem to show that with audacity he might have at least inflicted heavy losses on the enemy, for in 1626 the directors, ignorant of his failure, sent out a reinforcement of 9 ships and 5 yachts under the command of the redoubtable Piet Hein. Hein sailed on May the 21st for the West Indies, where he learned that Hendrikszoon was dead, and that the remnant of his expedition had returned after a fruitless voyage of misadventure. Hein, however, was not the man to turn back. He determined to try what he could effect at Bahia by a surprise attack. He reached the entrance to the bay on March the 1st, 1627, but was unluckily becalmed, and the Portuguese were warned of his presence. On arriving before San Salvador, he found 30 ships drawn up close to the land. 16 of these were large and armed, and 4 were galleons, with a considerable number of troops on board. The Dutch admiral, with great daring, determined to attack them by sailing between them and the shore, making it difficult for the guns on shore to fire on him without injury to their own ships. It was a hazardous stroke, for the passage was narrow, but entirely successful. One of the 4 galleons carrying the admiral's flag was sunk. The other 3 struck. Taking to their launches, the Dutchmen now fiercely assailed the other vessels, and in a very short time were masters of 22 prizes. It was a difficult task to carry them off at the ebb tide, and it was not achieved without loss. Hein's own ship, the Amsterdam, grounded and had to be burnt, and another ship by some mischance blew up. The total loss, except through the explosion, was exceedingly small. The captured vessels contained 2,700 chests of sugar, besides a quantity of cotton, hides, and tobacco. The booty was stored in the 4 largest ships and sent to Holland, and the rest were burnt. Hein now made a raid down the coast as far as Rio de Janeiro, and then returned. The Sea Terror of Delft, for some weeks after this, remained in unchallenged mastery of the bay, picking up prizes when the opportunity offered. Then he sailed by the West Indies homewards, and reached Dutch waters on October the 31st, 1627, having during this expedition captured no less than 55 enemy vessels. The value of the booty was sufficient to repay the company for their great outlay, and it was wisely used in the equipment of fresh fleets for the following year. This next year, 1628, was indeed an annus mirabilis in the records of the Dutch West India Company. On January the 24th, two fleets put to sea, one under Dirk Simonsz Uitgeest for the coast of Brazil, another under Pieter Arianzoon Ita for the West Indies. Both were successful and came back laden with spoil. It was reserved, however, for the expedition under Piet Hein to make all the successes seem small. This fleet, consisting of 31 ships of war, left Holland at the end of May for the West Indies with instructions to lie in wait for the Spanish treasure fleet. Many attempts had been made in previous years to intercept the galleons, which year by year carried the riches of Mexico and Peru to Spain, but they had always failed. After some weeks of weary cruising, Piet Hein, when off the coast of Cuba, was rewarded, September the 8th, by the sight of the Spanish fleet approaching, and at once bore down upon them. After a sharp conflict, the Spaniards took refuge in the Bay of Matanzas, and running the galleons into shoal water, tried to convey the rich cargoes on shore. It was in vain. The Dutch sailors, taking to their boats, boarded the galleons and compelled them to surrender. The spoil was of enormous value, comprising 177,537 pounds of silver, 135 pounds of gold, 37,375 hides, 2,270 chests of indigo, besides cochineal, logwood, sugar, spices, and precious stones. It brought 11,509,524 gulden into the coffers of the company, and a dividend of 50% was paid to the shareholders. It was a wrong policy thus to deal with the results of a stroke of good fortune not likely to be repeated. This year was, however, to be a lucky year unto the end. A fourth expedition under Adriaan Jansz Peter, which left on August the 15th for the Caribbean Sea, sailed up the Orinoco and destroyed the town San Tomé de Guiana, the chief Spanish settlement in those parts. All this, it may be said, partook of the character of buccaneering. Nevertheless, these were shrewd blows, struck at the very source from whence the Spanish power obtained means for carrying on the war. The West India Company was fulfilling triumphantly one of the chief purposes for which it was created, and was threatening Philip IV with financial ruin. The successes of 1628 had the effect of encouraging the directors to try to retrieve the failure at Bahia by conquest elsewhere. Olinda, on the coast of Pernambuco, was selected as the new objective. An expeditionary force of exceptional strength was got ready, and as Piet Hein, at the very height of his fame, unfortunately lost his life in the spring of 1629 in an encounter with the Dunkirk pirates, Hendrik Cornelis Lonck, who had served as vice-admiral under Hein at Matanzas Bay, was made admiral-in-chief with Jonker Diederik von Wadenburg in command of the military forces. Considerable delay was caused by the critical position of the United Provinces when invaded by the Spanish imperialist armies at the time of the siege of Hertogenbosch, but the capture of that fortress enabled the last contingents to sail towards the end of the year, and Lonck was able to collect his whole forces at St. Vincent, one of the Canary Islands, on Christmas Day, to start on their voyage across the Atlantic. That force consisted of 52 ships and yachts and 13 sloops, carrying 3,780 sailors and 3,500 soldiers, amounting 1,170 guns. Adverse weather prevented the arrival of the fleet in the offing of Olinda until February the 13th. Along the coast of Pernambuco runs a continuous reef of rock, with narrow openings at irregular intervals, forming a barrier against attack from the sea. Olinda, the capital of the provinces, was built on a hill a short distance inland, having as its port a village known as Povo or the Recife, lying on a spit of sand between the mouths of the rivers of the Biberibe and Capibarabe. There was a passage through the rocky reef northwards about 2 leagues above Olinda, and 3 others southwards, only one of which, the Barra, was navigable for large ships, giving access to a sheet of water of some 18 foot in depth between the reef and the spit of sand, and forming a commodious harbour, the Pozo. The problem before the Dutch commander was a difficult one, for news of the expedition had reached Madrid, and Matthias de Albuquerque, brother of the proprietor of Pernambuco, Duarte de Albuquerque, a man of great energy and powers of leadership, had arrived in October to put Olinda and the Recife into a state of defence. 2 forts, strongly garrisoned and armed, San Francisco and San Jorge, defended the entrances through the reef and the neck of the spit of sand. 16 ships, chained together and filled with combustibles, barred access to the harbour, and the village of the Recife was surrounded by entrenchments. Within the fortifications of Holland, Albuquerque held himself in readiness to oppose any body of the enemy that should effect a landing above the town. Lonck, after consultation with Waerdenburg, determined to make, with the main body of the fleet under his own command, an attempt to force the entrances to the Pozo, while Waerdenburg, with the bulk of the military contingent on 16 ships, sailed northward to find some spot suitable for disembarkation. The naval attack was made on February the 15th, but was unavailing. All the efforts of the Dutch to make their way through any of the entrances to the Pozo, though renewed again and again with utmost bravery, were beaten off. In the evening Lonck withdrew his ships. He had learned by an experience to which history scarcely offers an exception, that a naval attack unsupported by military cooperation against land defences cannot succeed. But Waerdenburg had used the opportunity, while the enemy's attention was directed to the repelling of the assault on the Recife, to land his army without opposition. At dawn the Dutch general advanced, and after forcing the crossing of the river Doce in the teeth of the resistance of a body of irregular troops led by Albuquerque in person, marched straight on Olinda. There was no serious resistance. The fortifications were carried by storm, and the town fell into the hands of Waerdenburg. The garrison and almost all the inhabitants fled into the neighbouring forest. Aware of the fact that the occupation of Olinda was useless without a harbour as a base of supplies, it was resolved at once, with the aid of the fleet, to lay siege to the forts of San Francisco and San Jorge. Despite obstinate resistance, first San Jorge, then San Francisco surrendered, and on March the 3rd the fleet sailed through the Barra, and the Recife, with the island of Antonio Vaz behind it, was occupied by the Dutch. No sooner was the conquest made than steps were taken for its administration. A welcome reinforcement arrived from Holland on March the 11th, having on board 3 representatives sent by the 19, who were to form, with Waerdenburg, appointed governor and administrative council or court of policy. The Recife, rather than Olinda, was selected as the seat of government, and forts were erected for its defence. The position, however, was perilous in the extreme. Albuquerque, who was well acquainted with the country and skilled in guerrilla warfare, formed an entrenched camp to which he gave the name of the Ariel de Bom Jesus, a position defended by marshes and thick woods. From this centre, by the aid of large numbers of friendly Indians, he was able to cut off all supplies of fresh water, meat or vegetables from reaching the Dutch garrison. They had to depend for the necessaries of life upon stores sent to them in relief fleets from Holland. It was a strange and grim struggle of endurance, in which both Dutch and Portuguese suffered terribly. The one on the barren seashore, the other in the pathless woods under the glare of a tropical sun, both alike looking eagerly for succour from the motherland. The Dutch succours were the first to arrive. The first detachment under Martin Thijssen reached the Recife on December the 18th, 1630. The main fleet under Adrian Jan zoon Peter on April 14th, 1631. The whole fleet consisted of 16 ships and yachts manned by 1,270 sailors and 860 soldiers. Their arrival was the signal for offensive operations. An expedition under Thijssen's command sailed on April 22nd for the large island of Itamarca, about 15 miles to the north of the Recife. It was successful. Itamarca was occupied and garrisoned, and thus a second and advantageous post established on the Brazilian coast. Meanwhile, the Spanish government had not been idle. After many delays, a powerful fleet set sail from Lisbon on May the 5th for Pernambuco, consisting of 15 Spanish and 5 Portuguese ships, and carrying a large military force, partly destined for Bahia, but principally as a reinforcement for Matthias de Albuquerque. The expedition was commanded by Admiral Antonio de Oquendo, and was accompanied by Duarte de Albuquerque, the proprietor of Pernambuco. After landing troops and munitions at Bahia, the Spanish wasted several weeks before starting again to accomplish the main object of blockading the Dutch in the Recife and compelling their surrender by famine. But Peter had learned by his scouts of the presence of Oquendo at Bahia, and though his force was far inferior, he determined to meet the hostile armada at sea. The Spanish fleet was sighted at early dawn on September the 12th, and Peter at once gave orders to attack. His fleet consisted of 16 ships and yachts, that of the enemy of 20 galleons and 16 caravels. The Dutch admiral had formed his fleet in 2 lines, himself in the Prins Willem and Vice Admiral Thijssen in the Verenigde Provinciën being the leaders. On this occasion the sight of the great numbers and size of the Spanish galleons caused a great part of the Dutch captains to lose heart and hang back. Peter and Thijssen, followed by only 2 ships, bore down upon the Spaniards. The Prins Willem, with the Valkeren in attendance, laid herself alongside the San Diego, flying the flag of Admiral Oquendo. The Verenigde Provinciën, with the Provincia van Utrecht in its wake, drew up to the San Antonio de Padua, the ship of Vice Admiral Francisco de Vallecilla. For 6 hours the duel between the Prins Willem and the San Diego went on with fierce desperation, the captain of the Valkeren gallantly holding at bay the galleons who attempted to come to the rescue of Oquendo. At 4 p.m. the San Diego was a floating wreck, with only a remnant of her crew surviving, when suddenly a fire broke out in the Prins Willem, which nothing could check. With difficulty the San Diego drew off, and finding that his vessel was lost, Peter refused to surrender, wrapped the flag round his body and threw himself into the sea. Meanwhile success had attended Thijssen. The lagging Dutch ships, coming up gradually, threatened the convoy of Spanish transport, and drew off many of the galleons for their protection. The Provincia van Utrecht, indeed, like the Prins Willem, caught fire and was burnt to the water's edge. But the Vice Admiral himself sank the San Antonio de Padua and another galleon that came to Vallechilla's help, and captured a third. It was a bloody and apparently indecisive fight, but the Dutch enjoyed the fruits of victory. Oquendo made no attempt to capture the Recife and Olinda, but after landing the troops he convoyed at a favourable spot, sailed northwards, followed by Thijssen. But although relieved, the position was still very serious. Albuquerque, now considerably reinforced from his impregnable post at the Arraial de Bom Jesus, cut off all intercourse inland. The Dutch even abandoned Olinda and concentrated themselves at the Reciff, where they remained as a besieged force, entirely dependent upon supplies sent from Holland. Several expeditions were dispatched with the hope of seizing other positions on the coast, but all of them proved failures, and when Waerdenburgh returned home in 1633, having reached the end of his 3 years as governor, all that could be said was that the Dutch had retained their foothold on the coast of Pernambuco, but at vast cost to the company in men, vessels and treasure, and without any apparent prospect for the future. But pertinacity was to be rewarded. For the period of success that followed, special victories must be consulted. In the year following the return of Waerdenburgh, the efforts of the Dutch authorities to extend their possessions along the coast at the various river mouths were steadily successful, and with the advent of Joan Maurice of Nassau to the governorship in 1637, the dream of a Dutch empire in Brazil seemed to be on the point of realisation. The cousin of the Prince of Orange was endowed with brilliant qualities, and during the 7 years of his governorship he extended the Dutch dominion from the Rio Grande in the south to the island of Maranhão on the north, and to a considerable distance inland. Indeed, over the larger part of 7 out of the 14 captaincies into which Portuguese Brazil was divided. On his arrival, by a wise policy of statesmanlike conciliation, he contrived to secure the goodwill of the Portuguese planters, who, though not loving the Dutch heretics, hated them less than their Spanish oppressors, and also of the Jews, who were numerous in the conquered territory. Under his rule, the Reciff, as the seat of the Dutch government, was beautified and enlarged. Many fine buildings and gardens adorned it, and the harbour made commodious for commerce, with rows of warehouses and ample docks. To the new capital he gave the name of Mauritsstad. During the early part of his governor-generalship, Joan Maurice was called upon to face a really great danger. The year 1639 was to witness what was to be the last great effort, before the Portuguese revolt, of the still undivided Spanish monarchy for supremacy at sea. Already it has been told how a great fleet sent under Antonio de Quevedo to drive the Dutch from the narrow seas was crushed by Admiral Tromp at the Battle of the Downs. In the same year the most formidable armada ever sent from the peninsula across the ocean set sail for Brazil. It consisted of no less than 86 vessels manned by 12,000 sailors and soldiers, under the command of the Count de Torre. Unpropitious weather conditions, as so often in the case of Spanish naval undertakings, ruined the enterprise. Making for Bahia, they were detained for 2 months in the Bay of All Saints by strong northerly winds. Meanwhile, Joan Maurice, whose naval force at first was deplorably weak, had managed, by energetic efforts, to gather together a respectable fleet of 40 vessels under Admiral Luce, which resembled the English fleet of 1588 under Effingham and Drake, in that it made up for lack of numbers and of size by superior seamanship and skill in manoeuvring. At length, the wind having shifted, the Count de Torre put to sea, and on January 12, 1640, the Dutch squadrons sighted the Spaniards, who were being driven along by a southerly gale which had sprung up. Clinging to their rear and keeping the weather gauge, the Dutch kept up a running fight, inflicting continual losses on their enemies, and giving them no opportunity to make for land and seek the shelter of a port, drove them northwards in disorder, never to return. By this signal deliverance, the hold of the Netherlanders upon their Brazilian conquests appeared to be assured, and, as has been already stated, Joan Maurice took full advantage of the opportunity that was offered to him to consolidate and extend them. A sudden change of political circumstances was, however, to bring to a rapid downfall a dominion which had never rested on a sound basis. The revolt of Portugal in 1641 was at first hailed in the United Provinces as the entry of a new ally into the field against their ancient enemy, the Spaniard. But it was soon perceived that there could be no friendship with independent Portugal, unless both the East and West India Companies withdrew from the territories they had occupied overseas, entirely at the expense of the Portuguese. King João IV and his advisers at Lisbon, face to face as they were with the menacing Spanish power, showed willingness to make great concessions, but they could not control the spirit which animated the settlers in the colonies themselves. Everywhere the Spanish yoke was repudiated, and the Dutch garrisons in Brazil suddenly found themselves confronted in 1645 with a loyalist rising, with which they were not in a position to deal successfully. The West India Company had not proved a commercial success. The fitting out of great fleets and the maintenance of numerous garrisons of mercenaries at an immense distance from the home country had exhausted their resources and involved the company in debt. The building of Maritstadt and the carrying out of João Maurice's ambitious schemes for the administration and organisation of a great Brazilian dominion were grandiose, but very costly. The governor, moreover, who could brook neither incompetence nor interference on the part of his subordinates, had aroused the enmity of some of them, notably of a certain Colonel Akitovsky, who through spite plotted and intrigued against him with the authorities at home. The result was that the directors, having declined to sanction certain proposals made to them by João Maurice, he sent in his resignation, which was accepted. It must be remembered that their position was a difficult one. The charter of the company had been granted for a term of 24 years, and it was doubtful whether the States General, already beginning to discuss secretly the question of a separate peace with Spain, would consent to renew it. The relations with Portugal were very delicate, and a formidable rebellion of the entire body of Portuguese settlers, aided by the natives, was on the point of breaking out. Indeed, the successors of João Maurice, deprived of any adequate succour from home, were enabled to maintain themselves against the skill and courage of the insurgent Portuguese leaders. The Dutch were defeated in the field, and one by one their fortresses were taken. The Recife itself held out for some time, but it was surrendered at last in 1654, and with its fall the Dutch were finally expelled from the territory, for the acquisition of which they had sacrificed so much blood and treasure. The West India Company at the Peace of Munster possessed, besides the remnant of its Brazilian dominion, the colony of New Netherland in North America, and two struggling settlements on the rivers Essequibo and Berbice in Guiana. New Netherland comprised the country between the English colonies of New England and Virginia, and the Dutch settlers had at this time established farms near the coast and friendly relations with the natives of the interior, with whom they trafficked for furs. The appointment of Peter Stuyvesant as governor in 1646 was a time of real development in New Netherland. The colony was an appanage of the Chamber of Amsterdam, after which New Amsterdam, the seat of government on the island of Manhattan, was named. The official trading posts on the Essequibo and the Berbice, though never abandoned, had for some years a mere lingering existence, but are deserving of a mention in that they were destined to survive the vicissitudes of fortune and to become in the 18th century a valuable possession. Their importance also is to be measured not by the meagre official reports and profit and loss accounts that have survived in the West India Company's records, but by the much fuller information to be derived from Spanish and Portuguese sources as to the remarkable daring and energy of Dutch trading agents in all that portion of the South American continent lying between the rivers Amazon and Orinoco. Expelled from the Amazon itself in 1627 by the Portuguese from Para, the Dutch traders established themselves at different times at the mouth of almost all the rivers along what was known as the wild coast of Guiana, and penetrating inland through a good understanding with the natives, especially with the ubiquitous Carib tribes, carried on a barter traffic beyond the mountains into the northern watershed of the Amazon, even as far as the Rio Negro itself. This trade with the interior finds no place in the company's official minutes, for it was, strictly speaking, an infringement of the charter and therefore illegitimate. But it was characteristically Dutch, and it was winked at, for the chief offenders were themselves among the principal shareholders of the company. No account of Dutch commerce during the period of Frederick Henry would be complete, however, which did not refer to the relations between Holland and Sweden, and the part played by an Amsterdam merchant in enabling the Swedish armies to secure the ultimate triumph of the Protestant cause in the 30 Years' War. Louis de Geer sprang from an ancient noble family of Liège. His father fled to Dordrecht in 1595 to escape from the Inquisition, and became prosperous in business. Liège was then, as now, a great centre of the iron industry, and after his father's death Louis de Geer in 1615 removed to Amsterdam, where he became a merchant in all kinds of iron and copper goods, more especially of ordnance and firearms. In close alliance with him, though not in partnership, was his brother-in-law, Elias Trip, the head of a firm reputed to have the most extensive business in ironware and weapons in the Netherlands. The commanding abilities of de Geer soon gave to the two firms, which continued to work harmoniously together as a family concern, a complete supremacy in the class of wares in which they dealt. At this time the chief supply of iron and copper ore came from Sweden, and in 1616 de Geer was sent on a mission by the States General to that country to negotiate for a supply of these raw materials for the forging of ordnance. This mission had important results, for it was the first step towards bringing about those close relations between Sweden and the United Provinces which were to subsist through the whole of the 30 Years' War. In the following year, 1617, Gustavus Adolphus, then about to conduct an expedition into Livonia, sent an envoy to Holland for the purposes of securing the good officers of the States General for the raising of a loan upon the security of the Swedish copper mines. The principal contributor was Louis de Geer. He had, during his visit to Sweden, learned how great was the wealth of that country in iron ore, and at the same time that the mines were lying idle and undeveloped through lack of capital and skilled workmen, he used his opportunity, therefore, to obtain from Gustavus the lease of the rich mining domain of Finspång. The lease was signed on October 12, 1619, and de Geer at once began operations on the largest scale. He introduced from Liège a body of expert Walloon ironworkers, built forges and factories, and was in a few years able to supply the Swedish government with all the ordnance and munitions of war that they required, and to export through the ports of Norrköping large supplies of goods to his warehouses at Amsterdam. His relations with Gustavus Adolphus soon became intimate. The king relied upon de Geer for the supply of all the necessaries for his armies in the field, and even commissioned him to raise troops for the Swedish service. In 1626 the Dutch merchant was appointed by the king acting manager of the copper mines, which were royal property, and in order to regularise his position and give him greater facilities for the conduct of his enterprises, the rights of Swedish citizenship were conferred by royal patent upon him. It was a curious position, for though de Geer paid many visits to Sweden, once for 3 consecutive years, 1626 to 29, he continued to make Amsterdam his home and principal residence. He thus had a dual nationality. Year after year saw an increasing number of mines and properties passing into the great financier's hands, and in return for these concessions he made large advances to the king for his triumphant expedition into Germany, advancing him in 1628 50,000 riksdaler, and somewhat later a further sum of 32,000 riksdaler. So confidential were the relations between them that Gustavus sent for de Geer to his camp at Kitzingen for a personal consultation on business matters in the spring of 1632. It was their last interview, for before that year closed the Swedish hero was to perish at Lutzen. The death of Gustavus made no difference to the position of Louis de Geer in Sweden, for he found Axel Oxenstierna a warm friend and powerful supporter. Among other fresh enterprises was the formation of a Swedo-Dutch company for trading on the west coast of Africa. In this company Oxenstierna himself invested money. In reward for his many services, the Swedish Council of Regency conferred upon de Geer and his heirs a patent of nobility, and as part repayment of the large loans advanced by him to the Swedish treasury, he obtained as his own the districts containing his mines and factories in different parts of Sweden, making him one of the largest landed proprietors in the country. He, on his part, in return for this, was able to show in a remarkable way that he was not ungrateful for the favours he had received. With Christian IV of Denmark, for many years, the Swedes and the Dutch had had constant disputes and much friction. This able and ambitious king, throughout a long and vigorous reign, which began in 1593, had watched with ever-increasing jealousy the passing of the Baltic trade into Dutch hands, and with something more than jealousy the rapid advance to power of the sister Scandinavian kingdom under Gustavus Adolphus. Of the 1,074 merchant ships that passed through the Sound between June the 19th and November the 16th, 1645, all but 49 came from Dutch ports, by far the largest number from Amsterdam, and from these Christian IV drew a large revenue by the exaction of harsh and arbitrary toll dues. Again and again the States General had complained and protested, and diplomatic pressure had been brought to bear upon the high-handed king, but without avail. Between Sweden and Denmark there had been, since Gustavus Adolphus came to the throne in 1613, no overt act of hostility, but smouldering beneath the surface of an armed truce were embers of latent rivalries, and ambitions ready at any moment to burst into flame. Christian IV was a Protestant, but his jealousy of Sweden led him in 1639 openly to take sides with the Catholic powers, Austria and Spain. Fearing that he might attempt to close the passage of the Sound, the States General and the Swedish Regency, 1640, concluded a treaty for securing the freedom and protection of shipping and commerce in the Baltic and North Seas, and one of the secret articles gave permission to Sweden to buy or hire ships in the Netherlands, and in case of necessity to enlist crews for the same. Outward peace was precariously maintained between the Scandinavian powers, when the seizure of a number of Swedish ships in the Sound in 1643 made Oxenstierna resolve upon a bold stroke. Without any declaration of war, the Swedish general Torstensson was ordered to lead his victorious army from North Germany into Denmark, and to force King Christian to cease intriguing with the enemy. Holstein, Schleswig and Jutland were speedily in Torstensson's hands, but the Danish fleet was superior to the Swedish, and he could make no further progress. Both sides turned to the United Provinces. Christian promised that the grievances in regard to the Sound dues should be removed if the States General would remain neutral. Oxenstierna addressed himself to Louis de Geer. The merchant, on behalf of the Swedish government, was instructed to approach the Stadtholder and the States General and to seek for naval assistance under the terms of the Treaty of 1640. And if he failed in obtaining their assent, then he, de Geer, should himself, in conformance with the secret article of that treaty, raise on his own account and equip a fleet of 30 ships for the Swedish service. De Geer soon discovered that Frederick Henry, being intent on peace negotiations, was averse to the proposal. The Stadtholder and the States General, acting under his influence, did not wish to create fresh entanglements by embroiling the United Provinces in a war with Denmark. De Geer, therefore, at once began, on his own responsibility, to equip ships in the various seaports of Holland and Zeeland, which had been the chief sufferers by the vexatious Sound Jews, and he succeeded in enlisting the connivance of the Estates of Holland to his undertaking. Before the end of April 1644, a fleet of 32 vessels was collected under the command of Maarten Thijssen. Its first efforts were unsuccessful. The Danish fleet effectually prevented the junction of Thijssen with the Swedes, and for a time he found himself blockaded in a narrow passage called the Listerdiep. Taking advantage of a storm which dispersed the Danes, the Dutch admiral at last was able to put to sea again, and early in July somewhat ignominiously returned to Amsterdam to refit. For the moment King Christian was everywhere triumphant. On July the 11th he gained a signal victory over the Swedish fleet at Kolberg Heath, and he had the satisfaction of seeing Torstenson compelled by the Imperialists to retreat from Jutland. But the energy and pertinacity of the Amsterdam merchant saved the situation. Though the retreat of Thijssen meant for him a heavy financial loss, De Geer never for a moment faltered in his purpose. Within 3 weeks Thijssen again put to sea with 22 ships, and by skilful manoeuvring he succeeded in making his way through the Skagerrak and the Sound, and finally brought his fleet to anchor in the Swedish harbour of Kalmar. From this harbour the united Swedo-Dutch squadrons sailed out on October the 23rd between Femern and Laaland, met the Danish fleet, and after a desperate conflict completely defeated and destroyed it. Thus were the wealth and resources of a private citizen of Amsterdam able to intervene decisively at a critical moment in the struggle for supremacy in the Baltic between the two Scandinavian powers. But it is not in the victory won by Maarten Thijssen that De Geer rendered his greatest service to Sweden. As the Swedish historian Fryxell truly says, "All that was won by the statesmanship of Oxenstierna, by the sword of Bernhard Torstenson and Wrangel in a desolated Germany streaming with blood, has been already lost again. But the benefits which Louis de Geer brought to Sweden by the path of peaceful industry and virtue, these still exist, and bear wholesome fruit to a late posterity." This expedition under Maarten Thijssen, who after his victory was created a Swedish noble and definitely entered the Swedish naval service, though connived at by Frederick Henry and the States General, did not express any desire on their part to aggrandize Sweden unduly at the expense of Denmark. If some great merchants, such as Louis de Geer and Elias Trip, were exploiting the resources of Sweden, others, notably a certain Gabriel Marcellus, had invested their capital in developing the Danish grazing lands, and politically and commercially the question of the Sound Jews, preeminently a Danish question, overshadowed all others in importance. The Dutch had no desire to give Sweden a share in the control of the Sound. They preferred, in the interests of their vast Baltic trade, to have to deal with Christian IV alone. The Swedish threat was useful in bringing diplomatic pressure to bear on the Danish king, but ultimately they felt confident that if he refused to make concessions in the matter of the Jews, they would compel him to do so. As one of their diplomatists proudly declared, the wooden keys of the Sound were not in the hands of King Christian, but in the wharves of Amsterdam. In June 1645 his words were put to a practical test. Admiral Witt de With, at the head of a fleet of 50 warships, was ordered to convoy 300 merchantmen through the Sound, peacefully if possible, if not by force. Quietly the entire fleet of 350 vessels sailed through the narrow waters. The Danish fleet and Danish forts made no attempt at resistance. All the summer De With cruised to and fro, and the Dutch traders suffered no molestation. Christian's obstinacy at last gave way before this display of superior might, and on August the 23rd, by the Treaty of Christianopel, he agreed to lower the tolls for 40 years and to make many other concessions that were required from him. At the same time, by Dutch mediation, peace was concluded between Denmark and Sweden, distinctly to the advantage of the former by the Treaty of Bromsebro. To pass to other regions. In the Levant, during the long residence of Cornelis Haga at Constantinople, trade had been greatly extended. Considerable privileges were conceded to the Dutch by the so-called capitulation, concluded by his agency with the Porte in 1612, and Dutch consuls were placed in the chief ports of Turkey, Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt, Tunis, Greece and Italy. The trading, however, with the Mediterranean and the Levant was left to private enterprise. The States General, which had given charters to the different companies, East India, West India and Northern, not being willing to create any further monopolies. The lack of coal and of metals has always seriously hindered industrial development in the United Provinces. Nevertheless, the advent into Holland of so many refugees, who were skilled artisans from the southern Netherlands, led to the establishment of various textile industries at Leyden, Haarlem and other towns. One of the chief of these was the dressing and dyeing of English cloth for exportation. Amsterdam, it should be mentioned, had already at this time become the home of the diamond industry. The art of cutting and polishing diamonds was a secret process brought to the city on the Wye by Portuguese Jews, who were expelled by Philip II. And in Amsterdam their descendants still retain a peculiar skill and craftsmanship that is unrivalled. Jewish settlers were indeed to be found in many of the Dutch towns, and it was through them that Holland became famous in 17th century Europe for the perfection of her goldsmiths and silversmiths' art, and for jewellery of every kind. Another industry which had its centre at Delft was that of the celebrated pottery and tiles known as Delftware. It will be evident from what has been said above that vast wealth flowed into Holland at this period of her history. But, as so often happens, this sudden growth of riches had a tendency to accumulate in the hands of a minority of the people, with the inevitable consequence, on the one hand, of the widening of the gulf which divided poverty from opulence, and on the other with the creation among rich and poor alike of a consuming eagerness and passion for gain, if not by legitimate means, then by wild speculation or corrupt venality. Bubble companies came into existence only to bring disaster on those who rashly invested their money in them. The fever of speculation rose to its height in the mania for the growing of bulbs, and more especially of tulips, which more and more absorbed the attention of the public in Holland in the years 1633 to 1636. Perfectly inordinate sums were offered in advance for growing crops or for particular bulbs, most of the transactions being purely paper speculations, a gambling in futures. Millions of guilders were risked and hundreds of thousands lost or won. In 1637 the crash came, and many thousands of people in Amsterdam, Haarlem, Leyden, Alkmaar and other towns in Holland were brought to ruin. The estates of Holland and the various municipal corporations, numbers of whose members were among the sufferers, were compelled to take official action to extend the time for the liquidation of debts, and thus to some extent limit the number of bankruptcies. The tulip mania reduced, however, so many to beggary that it came as a stern warning. It was unfortunately only too typical of the spirit of the time. Even worse in some ways was the venality and corruption which began to pervade the public life of the country. The getting of wealth, no matter how, was an epidemic which infected not merely the business community, but the official classes of the Republic. There was malversation in the admiralties and in the military administration. The government was in the hands of narrow oligarchies, who took care to oppose jealously any extension of the privileges which placed so much valuable patronage at their disposal. Even envoys to foreign courts were reputed not to be inaccessible to the receipt of presents, which were in reality bribes, and in the law courts the wealthy suitor or offender could generally count on a charitable construction being placed upon all points in his favour. The severe placard, for instance, against the public celebration of any form of worship but that of the Reformed religion, according to the decrees of the Synod of Dort, were notoriously not enforced. Those who were able and willing to pay for a dispensation found a ready and judicious toleration. This toleration was not entirely due to the venality of the officials, but rather to the spirit of materialistic indifference that was abroad among the orthodox Calvinists, who were alone eligible for public office. Large numbers of those who professed the established faith were in reality either nominal conformists, too much immersed in affairs to trouble about religious questions, or actually free thinkers in disguise. It must never be forgotten that in the United Provinces, taken as a whole, the Calvinists, whether orthodox or Arminian, formed a minority of the population. Even in Holland itself, more than half the inhabitants were Catholics, including many of the old families and almost all of the peasantry. Likewise in Utrecht, Gelderland and Overijssel, the Catholics were in the majority. The Generality lands, North Brabant and Dutch Flanders, were entirely of the Roman faith. In Holland, Zeeland, especially in Friesland and Groningen, the Mennonite Baptists and other sects had numerous adherents. Liberty of thought, and to a large extent of worship, was in fact at this time the characteristic of the Netherlands, and existed in spite of the unrepealed placards, which enforced under pain of heavy penalties a strict adherence to the principles of Dort. End of chapter 11.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Corey Samuel. History of Holland by George Edmundson. Chapter 12. Letters, Science and Art. The epithet glorious, roemrijk, has been frequently applied by Dutch historians to the period of Frederick Henry, and deservedly. The preceding chapter has told that it was a time of wonderful maritime and colonial expansion, of commercial supremacy and material prosperity. But the spirit of the Holland, which reached its culminating point of national greatness in the middle of the 17th century, was far from being wholly occupied with voyages of adventure and conquest on far distant seas, or engrossed in sordid commercialism at home. The rapid acquisition of wealth by successful trade is dangerous to the moral health and stability alike of individuals and of societies, and the vices which follow in its train had, as we have already pointed out, infected to a certain extent the official and commercial classes in the Dutch Republic at this epoch. There is, however, another side of the picture. The people of the United Provinces, in their long struggle for existence as a free and independent state, had had all the dormant energies and qualities of which their race was capable called into intense and many-sided activity, with the result that the quickening impulse, which had been sent thrilling through the veins, and which had made the pulses to throb with the stress of effort and the eagerness of hope, penetrated into every department of thought and life. When the Treaty of Münster was signed, Holland had taken her place in the very front rank in a civilized world, as the home of letters, science and art, and was undoubtedly the most learned state in Europe. In an age when Latin was the universal language of learning, it was this last fact which loomed largest in the eyes of contemporaries. The wars and persecutions which followed the Reformation made Holland the place of refuge of many of the most adventurous spirits, the choicest intellects, and the most independent thinkers of the time. Flemings and Walloons who fled from Alva and the Inquisition, Spanish and Portuguese Jews driven out by the fanaticism of Philip II, French Huguenots and German Calvinists found within the borders of the United Provinces a country of adoption, where freedom of the press and freedom of opinion existed to a degree unknown elsewhere until quite modern times. The social condition of the country, the disappearance of a feudal nobility, and the growth of a large and well-to-do burgher aristocracy, in whose hands the government of the Republic really lay, had led to a widespread diffusion of education and culture. All travellers in 17th century Holland were struck by the evidences which met their eyes, in all places that they visited, of a general prosperity, combined with great simplicity of life and quiet domesticity. Homely comfort was to be seen everywhere, but not even in the mansions of the merchant princes of Amsterdam was there any ostentatious display of wealth and luxury. Probably of no other people could it have been said that, amongst the Dutch, it was unfashionable not to be a man of business. And yet, in spite of this, there was none of that narrowness of outlook which is generally associated with burgher society immersed in trade. These men, be it remembered, were necessarily acquainted with many languages, for they had commercial relations with all parts of the world. The number too of those who had actually voyaged and travelled in far distant oceans, in every variety of climate, amidst every diversity of race, was very large, and their presence in their home circles and in social gatherings, and all they had to tell of their experiences, opened men's minds, stirred their imaginations, and aroused an interest and a curiosity which made even the stay-at-home Hollanders alert, receptive, and eager for knowledge. The act of William the Silent, in founding the University of Leyden as a memorial of the great deliverance of 1574, was prophetic of the future that was about to dawn upon the land, which, at the moment of its lowest fortunes, the successful defence of Leyden had done so much to save from utter disaster. For the reasons which have been already stated, scholars of renown, driven by intolerance from their own countries, found in a newly founded academy in Holland a home where they could pursue their literary work undisturbed, and gave to it a fame and celebrity which speedily attracted thousands of students, not only from the Netherlands, but also from foreign lands. This was especially the case during the terrible time when Germany was devastated by the 30 Years' War. Among the scholars and philologists who held chairs at Leyden during the first century of its existence are included a long list of names of European renown. Justus Lipsius and Josephus Justus Scaliger may be justly reckoned among the founders of the science of critical scholarship. These were of foreign extraction, as was Salmasius, one of their successors, famous for his controversy with John Milton. But only less industrious in the domain of philology and classical learning were the Netherlanders Gerardus Johannes Voetius (1577–1649) and his 5 sons, one of whom, Isaac (1618–89), may be even said to have surpassed his father, Daniel Heinsius (1580–1665), and his son Nicholas (1620–1681), men of immense erudition and critical insight, and the brilliant Latinist Caspar Barlaeus (1584–1648). Of theologians and their bitter disputes, posterity retains a less grateful remembrance. Gomarus and Arminius, by their controversies, were the authors of party strife and civil dissensions which led to the death of Oldenbarnevelt on the scaffold, and with them may be mentioned Episcopius, Vericius, Coecaesius, Bogerman, and Uitenbergaert. Not all these men had a direct connection with Leyden, for the success which attended the creation of the academy in that town quickly led to the erection of similar institutions elsewhere. Universities were founded at Franeker (1584), Groningen (1614), Amsterdam (1632), Utrecht (1636), and Harderwijk (1646). These had not the same attraction as Leyden for foreigners, but they quickly became, one and all, centres for the diffusion of that high level of general culture which was the distinguishing mark of the 17th century Netherlands. All the writers, whose names have just been mentioned, used Latin almost exclusively as their instrument of expression. But one name, the most renowned of them all, has been omitted, because through political circumstances he was compelled to spend the greater part of his life in banishment from his native land. Hugo Grotius, Huig van Groot, after his escape from the castle of Loevestein in 1621, though he remained through life a true patriot, never could be induced to accept a pardon, which implied an admission of guilt in himself or in Oldenbarnevelt. So the man, who was known to have been the actual writer of the Advocate's Justification, continued to live in straitened circumstances at Paris until Oxenstierna appointed him Swedish ambassador at the French court. This post he held for 11 years. Of his extraordinary ability and of the variety and range of his knowledge it is not possible to speak without seeming exaggeration. Grotius was in his own time styled the wonder of the world. He certainly stands intellectually as one of the very foremost men the Dutch race has produced. Scholar, jurist, theologian, philosopher, historian, poet, diplomatist, letter writer, he excelled in almost every branch of knowledge and made himself a master of whatever subject he took in hand. For the student of international law the treatise of Grotius, De Jure Belli et Pacis, still remains the textbook on which the later superstructure has been reared. His Mare Liberum, written expressly to controvert the Portuguese claim of an exclusive right to trade and navigate in the Indian Ocean, excited much attention in Europe, and was taken by James I to be an attack on the oft-asserted dominium maris of the English crown in the narrow seas. It led the king to issue a proclamation forbidding foreigners to fish in British waters, May 1609. Selden's Mare Clausum was a reply, written by the king's command, to the Mare Liberum. Of his strictly historical works, the Annales et Historiae de Rebus Belgicis, for its impartiality and general accuracy, no less than for its finished and lucid style, stands out as the best of all contemporary accounts from the Dutch side of the revolt of the Netherlands. As a theologian, Grotius occupied a high rank. His De Veritate Religionis Christianae and his Annotationes in Vetus et in Novum Testamentum are now out of date, but the De Veritate was in its day a most valuable piece of Christian apologetic, and was quickly translated into many languages. The Annotationes have, ever since they were penned, been helpful to commentators on the Scriptures for their brilliancy and suggestiveness on many points of criticism and interpretation. His voluminous correspondence, diplomatic, literary, confidential, is rich in information bearing on the history and the life of his time. Several thousands of these letters have been collected and published. But if the smouldering embers of bitter sectarian and party strife compelled the most brilliant of Holland's own sons to spend the last 23 years of his life in a foreign capital and to enter the service of a foreign state, Holland was at the same time, as we have seen, gaining distinction by the presence within her hospitable boundaries of men of foreign extraction famous for their learning. It was thus that both the Cartesian and Spinozan systems of philosophy had their birthplace on Dutch soil. René Descartes sought refuge from France at Amsterdam in 1629, and he resided at different places in the United Provinces, among them at the university towns of Utrecht, Franeker and Leyden, for 20 years. During this time he published most of his best-known works, including the famous Discours de la Méthode. His influence was great. He made many disciples who openly or secretly became Cartesians. Among his pupils was Baruch Spinoza (1632–1677), the apostle of pantheism. A Portuguese Jew by descent, Spinoza was born in Amsterdam and was a resident in his native city throughout life. The fame of Holland in 17th century Europe as the chosen home of learning had thus been established by scholars and thinkers whose literary language was ordinarily Latin. It is now time to speak of the brilliant band of poets, dramatists and stylists who cultivated the resources of their native tongue with such success as to make this great era truly the golden age of Dutch literature, properly so called. The growth of a genuine national literature in the Netherlands, which had produced during the latter part of the 13th century a Maar Landert and a Melis Stoke, was for some considerable time checked and retarded by the influence of the Burgundian regime, where French, as the court language, was generally adopted by the upper classes. The Netherland or Low German tongue thus became gradually debased and corrupted by the introduction of bastard words and foreign modes of expression. Nevertheless, this period of linguistic degradation witnessed the uprise of a most remarkable institution for popularizing the art of poesy. I refer to the literary guilds, bearing the name of Chambers of Rhetoric, which, though of French origin, became rapidly acclimatized in the Netherlands. In well nigh every town one or more of these guilds were established, delighting the people with their quaint pageantry and elaborate ritual, and forming centres of light and culture throughout the land. Rhyming, versifying, acting became through their means the recreation of many thousands of shopkeepers, artisans, and even peasants. And with all their faults of style and taste, their endless effusion of bad poetry, their feeble plays and rude farces, the mummery and buffoonery which were mingled even with their gravest efforts, the rhetoricians effectually achieved the great and important work of attracting an entire people in an age of ignorance and of darkness towards a love of letters, and thereby broke the ground for the great revival of the 17th century. Amsterdam at one time possessed several of these chambers of rhetoric, but towards the end of the 16th century they had all disappeared, with one brilliant exception, that of the blossoming Eglantine, otherwise known as the Old Chamber. Founded in 1518 under the special patronage of Charles V, the Eglantine weathered safely the perils and troubles of the revolt, and passed in 1581 under the joint direction of a certain noble triumvirate, Coornheert, Spiegel and Visscher. These men banded themselves together to raise, restore and enrich their mother tongue. But they were not merely literary purists and reformers. The Eglantine became in their hands and through their efforts the focus of new literary life and energy, and Amsterdam replaced fallen Antwerp as the home of Netherland culture. The senior member of the triumvirate, Dirk Volkerts Coornheert, led a stormy and adventurous life. He was a devoted adherent of William the Silent, and for a number of years, through good and ill fortune, devoted himself with pen and person to the cause of his patron. As a poet he did not attain any very high flight, but he was a great pamphleteer, and taking an active part in religious controversy, by his publications he drew upon himself a storm of opposition, and in the end of persecution. He was, like his patron, a man of moderate and tolerant views, which in an age of religious bigotry brought upon him the hatred of all parties and the accusation of being a free thinker. His stormy life ended in 1590. Hendrik Lorenz Spiegel (1549–1612) was a member of an old Amsterdam family. In every way a contrast to Coornheert, Spiegel was a Catholic. A prosperous citizen, simple, unostentatious and charitable, he spent the whole of his life in his native town, and being disqualified by his religion from holding public office, he gave all his leisure to the cultivation of his mind and to literary pursuits. The work on which his fame chiefly rests was a didactic poem entitled The Hartspiegel. In his pleasant country house upon the banks of the Amstel, beneath a wide and spreading tree, which he was wont to call the Temple of the Muses, he loved to gather a circle of literary friends, irrespective of differences of opinion or of faith, and with them to spend the afternoon in bright congenial converse on books and men and things. Roemer Visscher, the youngest member of the triumvirate, was, like Spiegel, an Amsterdammer, a Catholic and a well-to-do merchant. His poetical efforts did not attain a high standard, though his epigrams, which were both witty and quaint, won for him, from his contemporaries, the name of the Second Marshal. Roemer Visscher's fame does not, however, rest chiefly upon his writings. A man of great affability, learned, shrewd and humorous, he was exceedingly hospitable, and he was fortunate in having a wife of like tastes and daughters more gifted than himself. During the 20 years which preceded his death in 1620, his home was the chosen rendezvous of the best intelligence of the day. To the young he was ever ready to give encouragement and help, and struggling talent always found in him a kindly critic and a sympathizing friend. He lived to see and to make the acquaintance of Brederôo, Vondel, Cats and Huygens, the men whose names were to make the period of Frederick Henry the most illustrious in the annals of Dutch literature. Gerbrand Adriaens Brederôo, strictly speaking, did not belong to that period. He died prematurely in 1618, a victim while still young to a wayward life of dissipation and disappointment. His comedies, written in the rude dialect of the fish market and the street, are full of native humour and originality, and give genuine glimpses of low life in old Amsterdam. His songs show that Brederôo had a real poetic gift. They reveal, beneath the rough and at times coarse and licentious exterior, a nature of fine susceptibilities and almost womanly tenderness. Joost van den Vondel was born in the same year as Brederôo, 1587, but his career was very different. Vondel survived until 1679, and during the whole of his long life his pen was never idle. His dramas and poems, in the edition of Van Lennep, fill 12 volumes. Such a vast production, as is inevitable, contains material of very unequal merit, but it is not too much to say that the highest flights of Vondel's lyric poetry, alike in power of expression and imagery, in the variety of metre and the harmonious cadence of the verse, deserve a far wider appreciation than they have ever received, through the misfortune of having been written in a language little known and read. Vondel was the son of an Antwerp citizen, compelled as a Protestant to fly from his native town after its capture by Parma. He took refuge at Cologne, where the poet was born, and afterwards settled at Amsterdam. In that town Vondel spent all his life, first as a shopkeeper, then as a clerk in the city savings bank. He was always a poor man. He never sought for the patronage of the great, but rather repelled it. His scathing attacks on those who had compassed the death of Oldenbarnevelt and his adhesion to the Remonstrant cause brought him in early life into disfavour with the party in power, while later his conversion to Catholicism in 1641 and his eager and zealous advocacy of its doctrines were a perpetual bar to that public recognition of his talents which was his due. Vondel never at any time sacrificed his convictions to his interest, and he wrote poetry not from the desire of wealth or fame, but because he was a born poet, and his mind found in verse the natural expression of its thought and emotions. But, though Vondel was a poor man, he was not unlearned. On the contrary, He was a diligent student of Greek and Latin literature, and translated many of the poetical masterpieces in those languages into Dutch verse. Indeed, so close was his study that it marred much of his own work. Vondel wrote a great number of dramas, but his close imitation of the Greek model with its chorus, and his strict adherence to the unities, render them artificial in form and lacking in movement and life. This is emphasised by the fact that many of them are based on scriptural themes, and by the monotony of the Alexandrine metre, in which all the dialogues are written. It is in the choruses that the poetical genius of Vondel is specially displayed. Lyrical gems in every variety of metre are to be found in the Vondelian dramas, alike in his youthful efforts and in those of extreme old age. Of the dramas, the finest and the most famous is the Lucifer, 1654, which treats of the expulsion of Lucifer and his rebel host of angels from heaven. We are here in the presence of a magnificent effort to deal grandiosely with a stupendous theme. The conception of the personality of Lucifer is of heroic proportions, and a comparison of dates renders it at least probable that this Dutch drama passed into John Milton's hands, and that distinct traces of the impression it made upon him are to be found in certain passages of the Paradise Lost. Vondel also produced hundreds of occasional pieces, besides several lengthy religious and didactic poems. He even essayed an epic poem on Constantine the Great, but it was never completed. Of the occasional poems, the finest are perhaps the triumph songs over the victories of Frederick Henry, and of the great admirals Tromp and De Ruyter. Jacob Cats, 1577 to 1660, lived, like Vondel, to a great age, but in very different circumstances. He was a native of Dordrecht and became pensionary of that town, and though not distinguished as a statesman or politician, he was so much respected for his prudence and moderation that for 22 years he filled the important office of Council Pensionary of Holland, and was twice sent as an envoy extraordinary to England. He was a prolific writer, and was undoubtedly the most popular and widely read of the poets of his time. His works were to be found in every Dutch homestead, and he was familiarly known as Father Cats. His gifts were, however, of a very different order from those of Vondel. His long poems dealt chiefly with the events of domestic, everyday existence, and the language, simple, unpretentious, and at times commonplace, was nevertheless not devoid of a certain restful charm. There are no high flights of imagination or of passion, but there are many passages as rich in quaint fancy as in wise maxims. With Constantine Huygens, 1596 to 1687, the writing of verse was but one of the many ways in which one of the most cultured, versatile, and busy men of his time found pleasant recreation in his leisure hours. The trusted secretary, friend, and counsellor of 3 successive Princes of Orange, Huygens in these capacities was enabled for many years to render great service to Frederick Henry, William II, and William III, more especially perhaps to the last named, during the difficult and troubled period of his minority. Nevertheless, all these cares and labours of the diplomatist, administrator, courtier, and man of the world did not prevent him from following his natural bent for intellectual pursuits. He was a man of brilliant parts and of refined and artistic tastes. Acquainted with many languages and literatures, an accomplished musician and musical composer, a generous patron of letters and of art, his poetical efforts are eminently characteristic of the personality of the man. His volumes of short poems, Hofwerk, Kluisjerwerk, Voorhout, and Zeestraat, contain exquisite and witty pictures of life at The Hague, the village of villages, and are at once fastidious in form and pithy in expression. It remains to speak of the man who may truly be described as the central figure among his literary contemporaries. Peter Cornelis Hooft, 1583 to 1647, was indisputably the first man of letters of his time. He sprang from one of the first families of the burgher aristocracy of Amsterdam, in which city his father, Cornelis Pieters Hooft, filled the office of burgomaster no less than 13 times. He began even as a boy to write poetry, and his strong bent to literature was deepened by a prolonged tour of more than 3 years in France, Germany and Italy, almost 2 years of which were spent at Florence and Venice. After his return he studied jurisprudence at Leyden, but when he was only 26 years old he received an appointment which was to mould and fix the whole of his future career. In 1609 Prince Maurice, in recognition of his father's great services, nominated Hooft to the coveted post of Drost, or governor, of Muiden and bailiff of Gueeland. This post involved magisterial and administrative duties of a by no means onerous kind, and the official residence of the Drost, the High House of Muiden, an embattled feudal castle with pleasant gardens, lying at the point where at no great distance from Amsterdam the river Vecht sleepily empties itself into the Zuider Zee, became henceforth for 30 years a veritable home of letters. Hooft's literary life may be divided into 2 portions. In the decade after his settlement at Muiden he was known as a dramatist and a writer of pretty love songs. His dramas, Gerard van Velzen, Warrenar and Beuto, caught the popular taste and were frequently acted, but are not of high merit. His songs and sonnets are distinguished for their musical rhythm and airy lightness of touch, but they were mostly penned, as he himself tells us, for his own pleasure and that of his friends, not for general publication. There are, nevertheless, charming pieces in the collected edition of Hooft's poems, and he was certainly an adept in the technicalities of metrical craft. But Hooft himself was ambitious of being remembered by posterity as a national historian. He aimed at giving such a narrative of the struggle against Spain as would entitle him to the name of the Tacitus of the Netherlands. He wished to produce no mere chronicle, like those of Bohr or Van Meteren, but a literary history in the Dutch tongue, whose style should be modelled on that of the great writer, whose works Hooft is said to have read through 52 times. He first, to try his hand, wrote a life of Henry IV of France, which attained great success. Louis XIII was so pleased with it that he sent the author a gold chain and made him a Knight of St. Michael. Thus encouraged, on August 19, 1628, Hooft began his Netherland histories, and from this date until his death in 1647 he worked ceaselessly at the magnum opus, which, beginning with the abdication of Charles V, he intended to carry on until the conclusion of the 12 years' truce. He did not live to bring the narrative further than the end of the Leicester regime. In a small tower in the orchard at Muiden he kept his papers, and here, undisturbed, he spent all his leisure hours for 19 years engaged on the great task, on which he concentrated all his energies. He himself tells us of the enormous pains that he took to get full and accurate information, collecting records, consulting archives, and submitting every portion as it was written to the criticism of living authorities, more especially to Constantine Huygens, and through him to the Prince of Orange himself. Above all, Hooft strove, to use his own words, never to conceal the truth, even were it to the injury of the fatherland. And the carrying out of this principle has given to the great prose epic that he wrote a permanent value, apart altogether from its merits as a remarkable literary achievement. And yet, perhaps the most valuable legacy that Hooft has left to posterity is his collection of letters. Of these a recent writer has declared that, though it could not be asserted that they, Hooft's letters, threw into the shade the whole of the rest of Netherland literature, still the assertion would not be far beyond the mark. They deal with every variety of subject, grave and gay, and they give us an insight into the literary, social and domestic life of the Holland of his time, which is of more value than any history. In these letters we find lifelike portraits of the scholars, poets, dramatists, musicians, singers, courtiers, and travellers, who formed that brilliant society which received from their contemporaries the name of the Muiden Circle, Muidener Krieg. The genial and hospitable Drost loved to see around him those 5 or 6 couple of friends, whom he delighted to invite to Muiden. Hooft was twice married, and both his wives, Christina van Earp and Helenoor Hellemans, were charming and accomplished women, endowed with those social qualities which gave an added attractiveness to the Muiden gatherings. Brand, Hooft's biographer, describes Christina as of surpassing capacity and intelligence, as beautiful, pleasing, affable, discreet, gentle, and gracious, as such a man could desire to have. While, of Helenoor, Hooft himself writes, "Within this house one ever finds sunshine, even when it rains without." This reference to the 2 hostesses of Muiden calls attention to one of the noteworthy features of social life in the Holland of this period, namely, the high level of education among women belonging to the upper burgher class. Anna and Maria Tesselschade Visscher and Anna Maria Schuurman may be taken as examples. Anna, the elder of the 2 daughters of Roma Visscher, 1584 to 1651, was brought up amidst cultured surroundings. For some years after her mother's death, she took her place as mistress of the house, which until 1620 had been the hospitable rendezvous of the Literary Society of Amsterdam. She was herself a woman of wide erudition, and her fame as a poet was such as to win for her, according to the fashion of the day, the title of the Dutch Sappho. Tesselschade, 10 years younger than her sister and educated under her fostering care, was, however, destined to eclipse her, alike by her personal charms and her varied accomplishments. If one can believe all that is said in her praise by Hooft, Huygens, Barlius, Brederôo, Vondel, and Cats, she must indeed have been a very marvel of perfect womanhood. As a singer, she was regarded as being without a rival, and her skill in painting, carving, etching on glass, and tapestry work was much praised by her numerous admirers. Her poetical works, including her translation into Dutch verse of Tasso's Jerusalemi Liberata, have almost all unfortunately perished, but a single ode that survives, the Ode to a Nightingale, is an effort not unworthy of Shelley, and shows her possession of a true lyrical gift. At Muiden, the presence of the beautiful Tesselschade was almost indispensable. "What feast would be complete," wrote Hooft to her, "at which you were not present? Favour us then with your company if it be possible." And again, "That you will come is my most earnest desire. If you will but be our guest, then, I hope, you will cure all our ills." He speaks of her to Barlaeus as the priestess, and it is clear that at her shrine all the frequenters of Muiden were ready to burn the incense of adulation. Both Anna and Tesselschade, like their father, were devout Catholics. Anna Maria van Schuurman, 1607 to 84, was a woman of a very different type. She does not seem to have loved or to have shone in society, but she was a very phenomenon of learning. She is credited with proficiency in painting, carving, and other arts, but it is not on these, so to speak, necessary accomplishments that her fame rests, but on the extraordinary range and variety of her solid erudition. She was at once linguist, scholar, theologian, philosopher, scientist, and astronomer. She was a remarkable linguist, and had a thorough literary and scholarly knowledge of French, English, German, Italian, Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Syriac, Chaldee, Arabic, and Ethiopic. Her reputation became widespread, and in the latter part of her long life many strangers went to Utrecht, where she resided, to try to get a glimpse of so great a celebrity. which was not easy owing to her aversion to such visits. Turning to the domain of mathematical and physical science, and of scientific research and discovery, we find that here also the 17th century Netherlanders attained the highest distinction. As mathematicians Simon Stevin, the friend and instructor of Maurice of Orange, and Francis van Schooten, the Leyden professor, who numbered among his pupils Christian Huygens and John de Witt, did much excellent work in the earlier years of the century. The published writings of de Witt on the properties of curves and on the theory of probabilities show that the greatest of Dutch statesmen might have become famous as a mathematician had the cares of administration permitted him to pursue the abstract studies that he loved. Of the scientific achievements of Christian Huygens (1629–95), the brilliant son of a brilliant father, it is difficult to speak in adequate terms. There is scarcely any name in the annals of science that stands higher than his. His abilities as a pure mathematician place him in the front rank among mathematicians of all time, and yet the services that he rendered to mathematical science were surpassed by his extraordinary capacity for the combination of theory with practice. His powers of invention, of broad generalization, of originality of thought were almost unbounded. Among the mathematical problems with which he dealt successfully were the theory of numbers, the squaring of the circle, and the calculation of chances. To him we owe the conception of the law of the conservation of energy, of the motion of the centre of gravity, and of the undulatory theory of light. He expounded the laws of the motion of the pendulum, increased the power of the telescope, invented the micrometer, discovered the rings and satellites of Saturn, constructed the first pendulum clock, and a machine called the gunpowder machine, in principle the precursor of the steam engine. For sheer brain power and inventive genius, Christian Huygens was a giant. He spent the latter years of his life in Paris, where he was one of the founders and original members of the Académie des Sciences. Two other names of scientists who gained a European reputation for original research and permanent additions to knowledge must be mentioned: those of Antony van Leeuwenhoek (1632–1723) and of Jan Swammerdam (1637–80). Leeuwenhoek was a lifelong observer of minute life. The microscope, the invention of which was due to a Dutchman, Cornelius Drebbel, was the favourite instrument of his patient investigations, and he was able greatly to improve its mechanism and powers. Among the results of his labours was the discovery of the infusoria and the collection of a valuable mass of information concerning the circulation of the blood and the structure of the eye and brain. Swammerdam was a naturalist who devoted himself to the study of the habits and the metamorphoses of insects, and he may be regarded as the founder of this most important branch of scientific inquiry. His work forms the basis on which all subsequent knowledge on this subject has been built up. To say that the Dutch school of painting attained its zenith in the period of Frederick Henry and the decades which preceded and followed it is scarcely necessary. It was the age of Rembrandt. The works of that great master and of his contemporaries, most of whom were influenced and many dominated by his genius, are well known to every lover of art, and are to be seen in every collection of pictures in Europe. One has, however, to visit the Rijksmuseum at Amsterdam and the Mauritshuis at The Hague to appreciate what an extraordinary outburst of artistic skill and talent had at this time its birth within the narrow limits of the northern Netherlands. To the student of Dutch history these two galleries are a revelation, for there we see 17th century Holland portrayed before us in every phase of its busy and prosperous public, social and domestic life. Particularly is this the case with the portraits of individuals and of civic and guild groups by Rembrandt, Frans Hals, Van der Helst and their followers, which form an inimitable series that has rarely been equalled. To realise to what an extent in the midst of war the fine arts flourished in Holland, a mere list of the best known painters of the period will suffice. It tells its own tale. They are given in the order of their dates: Frans Hals, 1584 to 1666; Gerard Honthorst, 1592 to 1662; Jan van Goyen, 1596 to 1656; Jan Wyvants, 1600 to 87; Albert Kuip, 1606 to 72; Jan Levens, 1607 to 63; Rembrandt van Rijn, 1608 to 69; Gerard Terburg, 1608 to 81; Adrian Brewer, 1608 to 41; Ferdinand Bol, 1609 to 81; Salomon Koning, 1609 to 74; Andreas Both, 1609 to 60; Jan Both, 1610 to 62; Adrian van Ostade, 1610 to 85; Bartholomeus van der Helst, 1613 to 70; Gerard Douw, 1613 to 80; Gabriel Metzu, 1615 to 58; Govert Flink, 1615 to 60; Isaac van Ostade, 1617 to 71; Art van der Neer, 1619 to 83; Peter de Koning, 1619 to 89; Philip Rubermans, 1620 to 68; Peter van der Hoog, unknown; Nicholas Berchem, 1624 to 83; Paul Potter, 1625 to 54; Jacob Ruysdael, 1625 to 81; Meindert Hubberma, unknown; Jan Steen, 1626 to 79; Samuel van Hoogstraden, 1627 to 78; Ludolf Backhuizen, 1631 to 1709; Jan van der Meer of Delft, 1632, unknown; Nicholas Mays, 1632 to 93; William van der Velde, 1633 to 1707; Frans de Meris, 1635 to 81; Caspar Netscher, 1639 to 84; Adrian van der Velde, 1639 to 72. It is strange that little is known of the lives of the great majority of these men. They are scarcely more than names, but their memory survives in their works. No better proof could be brought of the general abundance of money, and at the same time of the widespread culture of the land, than the fact that art found among all classes so many patrons. The aristocratic burgher magistrates and the rich merchants loved to adorn their houses with portraits and a choice selection of pictures. It was a favourite investment of capital, and there was a certain amount of rivalry among the principal families in a town like Amsterdam in being possessed of a fine collection. The Six collection still remains as an example upon the walls of the 17th century house of Burgomaster Six, where it was originally placed. The governing bodies of guilds and boards, members of corporations, the officers of the town schutterij or of archer companies delighted to have their portraits hung around their council chambers or halls of assembly. In the well-to-do farmer homesteads, and even in the dwellings of the poorer classes, pictures were to be found, as one may see in a large number of the interiors which were the favourite subject of the genre painters of the day. But with all this demand, the artists themselves do not seem to have in any case been highly paid. The prices were low. Even Rembrandt himself, whose gains were probably much larger than those of any of his contemporaries, and whose first wife, Saskia Ulenberg, was a woman of means, became bankrupt in 1656, and this at a time when he was still in his prime and his powers at their height. Some of his most famous pictures were produced at a later date. During the 30 Years' War, Holland became the centre of the publishing and bookselling trade, and Leyden and Amsterdam were famed as the foremost seats of printing in Europe. The devastation of Germany and the freedom of the press in the United Provinces combined to bring about this result. The books produced by the Elsevier's at Leyden and by Van Weersberg and Kloppenberg at Amsterdam are justly regarded as fine specimens of the printer's art, while the maps of Willem Jans Blauw and his Dutch contemporaries were quite unrivalled and marked a great step forward in cartography. This chapter must not conclude without a reference to the part taken by the Netherlanders in the development of modern music and the modern stage. The love of music was widespread, and the musicians of the Netherlands were famed alike as composers and executants. It was from its earlier home in the Low Countries that the art of modern music spread into Italy and Germany, and indeed into all Europe. Similarly, in the late Middle Ages, the people of the Netherlands were noted for their delight in scenic representations, and for the picturesque splendour with which they were carried out. The literary guilds, named Chambers of Rhetoric, never took such deep root elsewhere, and in the performance of mystery plays and moralities, and of lighter comic pieces, Chuttementen and Cluyten, many thousands of tradespeople and artisans took part. In the 17th century all the Chambers of Rhetoric had disappeared, with the single exception of the famous Old Chamber at Amsterdam, known as the Blossoming Eglantine, to which the leading spirits of the golden age of Dutch literature belonged, and which presided over the birth of the Dutch stage. From the first the stage was popular and well supported, and the new theatre of Amsterdam, the Schouwburg, completed in 1637, became speedily renowned for the completeness of its arrangements and the ability of its actors. Such indeed was their reputation that travelling companies of Dutch players visited the chief cities of Germany, Austria and Denmark, finding everywhere a ready welcome and reaping a rich reward, whilst at Stockholm, for a time, a permanent Dutch theatre was established. End of chapter 12.